Hi everyone, my name is Dolores Peralta and I'm a Philadelphia-based wine educator. I work for a company called WTSO and also teach WSET courses in Philadelphia. Today we're going to be talking about tannins. Tannins play an important role in many wines, but can be a difficult topic to grasp both from a theoretical standpoint and also from a tasting standpoint. So what we're going to do is try to break down this topic in order to better understand the role of tannins in wine. This lesson includes a comparative tasting where we'll be able to examine how tannins are expressed in different wine styles. Let's start with defining tannins in the broadest sense. From a biochemical standpoint, tannins are a group of water-soluble, astringent phenolic compounds found in plants. As enophiles, we often think of tannins, even in this plural form, as something that contributes a singular texture to wine, but tannins form this really large group of many complex compounds. Tannins are found abundantly in nature in things like tea, cacao and finished chocolate, wood, and wood bark, coffee beans, nuts and seeds, and all sorts of different fruits and vegetables, including pomegranates, apple skins, berries, and of course grapes. In grapes, tannins are found in the skins, seeds, and stems regardless of the grape's color. The level of tannins that we eventually experience in a finished wine depends on the grape variety itself, as well as certain production methods that we'll talk about shortly. Before we talk about wine though, let's take a step back and talk about what phenolic content actually means. The phenolic content of a wine consists of all of the compounds in that wine that are derived from phenols. Phenols are the molecular building block made up of a hydroxyl group, which is the oxygen and hydrogen connected to a phenol ring. When multiple phenols bind, they form what are known as polyphenols, poly meaning multiple. All of the phenols in a wine are part of the overall wine's phenolic content. Polyphenols are a large class of plant secondary metabolites, which are substances that are produced by plants that aid in the protection and survival of the plant, but aren't directly involved in its growth, development, or reproduction. They're mainly responsible for defense and protective mechanisms of that plant. Polyphenols give plants color, odor, and flavor and are considered antioxidants, which provide health benefits when consumed. Antioxidants inhibit oxidation, which is important not just for us, but also for wine. Polyphenols themselves can be broken down into multiple groups and categories based on their chemical composition and their biology or function. Two important subgroups for wine are called flavonoids and non-flavonoids. I'm not going to go into the differences here because it gets into some pretty heavy chemistry, but it's important to note that both categories, flavonoids and non-flavonoids, contribute to wine in different ways. Flavonoids in particular comprise up to 90% of the phenolic content of red wines and a little less so in whites and rosés based on the production method. Flavonoids contribute color, astringency, texture, and bitterness to wines, and tannins fall into this group. It's also important to note that flavonoids and wine are kind of all connected. Catechins, which give wine bitterness and astringency, serve as the building blocks of condensed tannins, which are also known as proanthocyanidins. These proanthocyanidins are reactive molecules that then release red anthocyanidin pigments when heated in an acidic medium, which is wine. Tannins themselves can be divided into two main categories, hydrolyzable and condensed. Hydrolyzable tannins are ones that break down in water or react with water. They go through this process known as hydrolysis, and then they form other substances. This category of tannins are really important in the tanning industry because they help to alter the protein structure of animal skins and hides, making them more durable, essentially producing leather. These tannins are also referred to as commercial or enological tannins, and oak and grape seeds are actually a really important source. Condensed tannins are known as non-hydrolyzable, meaning they won't readily break down in water. These tannins are referred to as proanthocyanidins, which we mentioned briefly in the previous slide. These types of tannins are the most important in wine because they're the ones that bind with the proteins and give us the sensation of astringency when we taste wine. They also form insoluble precipitates, which is a fun way of saying sediment. Now that everyone's passed the chemistry portion, it's time for a quick biology lesson. We know that tannins are found in grapes, but now we have to talk about the start of the process from grape to wine, which begins in the vineyard. If you've ever eaten an unripe wine grape straight off the vine, you'll notice how horrible it is. It's bitter, astringent, sour, you get the picture. These unpleasant sensations tie back to those defense mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. It's the plant's natural defense against being eaten before it's able to ripen properly. Animals learn that unripe grapes taste pretty gross, so they know to wait until that fruit reaches sugar ripeness before consuming it and taking part in seed dispersal. Sugar ripeness is good enough for the birds, but not necessarily for wine. Sugar ripeness is a really useful tool in determining the potential alcohol of a wine, but it's clear that that alone doesn't always equate to a good tasting or good quality wine. Grape growers and winemakers now know that the phenolic content of a grape should also reach a certain level of ripeness in order to achieve better flavor, color, and texture in their final product. This level of ripening is known as phenolic or physiological ripeness. Unlike sugar ripening, which is pretty easy to measure, determining proper phenolic ripeness is more of an art and far more subjective. This level of ripeness is based on the style of wine that a winemaker wishes to achieve, and picking too early can result in green flavors and textures, while waiting too long results in overripe, jammy flavors and even flabby textures in your wine. Even though the grape grower or wine producer are involved in determining when to pick a grape according to their desired level of ripeness, they're still at the mercy of Mother Nature. The overall climate of a region, as well as the characteristics of individual vintages, can cause tannins to express themselves differently, even in the same grape variety. Syrah, for example, sourced from the Rhone Valley, produces a very different style of wine than it does as Shiraz in Australia. The same goes for Cabernet grown in Bordeaux versus in Napa Valley or even in the high elevation vineyards of Mendoza. So now that we know how life in the vineyard can affect a wine's phenolic content, we can finally start talking about what's really important here, the wine. When talking about tannins in wine, we're really focusing on red wines. While white wines may have some tannins, they're generally less discernible on our palates. In red wine, the concentration of tannins is a result of how much the tannins have been extracted into the juice and pulp. This is determined by the individual grape variety, the extraction during fermentation and maceration, any additions of tannins, and even tannin precipitation. During fermentation and maceration, tannins and other phenolic compounds leach into the wine, and how many of these compounds are extracted is determined by the temperature. So higher temperatures pull more compounds into the wine. The time, longer macerations lend more compounds into the wine as well, which explains why white wines and rosés essentially have no discernible tannins. The alcohol contents, and any kind of physical manipulation, which includes pumping over, punching down, rack and return, and other forms of cap submersion, which are methods used to aid in extracting both tannins and colors. After a red wine ferments, the liquid is separated from the solids, and this is usually done through pressing in stages with increasing pressure. The most aggressively pressed wine will contain the highest levels of tannins, and this wine can then be added to any free-run wine or more gently pressed wine in order to achieve the desired texture and structure. Hydrolyzable tannins like those found in oak and grape seeds can also be used to bolster a wine's overall tannic feel. These can be included through the use of oak barrels, chips, staves, tannin powders, and even leaving in some of the grape seeds and stems as a wine ferments and macerates. New oak barrels in particular will impart not just distinct flavors to a wine, but also tannins. Unless you work in a lab that can analyze a finished wine's phenolic content, the best way to determine how tannins are expressed in a wine is to taste it. In finished red wines, tannins contribute texture, mouthfeel, and structure, and in some cases bitterness. The reason we feel this rough, drying sensation is because the tannins bind to the proteins in your saliva and mucous membranes and cause your tissues to contract. Describing the tannins of a wine involves talking about quantity, but also quality. A wine may have low levels of tannins, but these tannins could be harsh or green or grippy. They could also be silky and smooth or fine-grained. A high tannin wine can also be described in the same manner. It can be smooth and plush or velvety, but can also be harsh or aggressive or green, but just on a much higher level. As we start tasting wines, it's important to ask yourself questions like, how quickly can you feel the tannins? Do they build on your palate? Do they coat your entire mouth? Are they balanced, well integrated, etc.? And that being said, it's time to finally crack open a bottle and start tasting. The first wine we're tasting is a white wine. This wine serves the purpose of getting your palate prepared for tasting in general, but also allows us to really focus on acidity without tannins getting in the way. In many wines, acidity and tannins create a balance, one causing your mouth to water and one drying it out. This can make it difficult to determine the true quantity and quality of tannins in a wine. If we really focus on the feel of acidity, it can help us to better separate these sensations on our palate. Here we have a 2018 Bordeaux Blanc made of a blend of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. Both of these grapes are generally used to produce wines with low to no discernible tannins, which is exactly what we experience here. In this wine, we have production methods that purposefully avoid any excessive phenolic extraction. The grapes are pressed quickly and the juice and skins are immediately separated. Fermentation is temperature controlled and takes place in stainless steel. The result is a relatively simple style, with Sauvignon Blanc adding fresh acidity to Semillon's round texture and fleshy fruit. While this particular wine doesn't have any discernible tannins, there are some white wines that do go through an extended period of skin contact. This short maceration pulls additional flavors, color, and texture into the wine, but doesn't necessarily give the wine aggressive tannins. Riesling and Gewürztraminer are two grapes that sometimes go through the slightly extended skin contact. There's also a newish trend of orange wines, which are essentially white wines that are vinified in the same manner as red wines. These wines have bolder flavors, darker color that kind of veers on orange or amber, and notable tannins. These wines won't be nearly as tannic as red wines, but like red wines, the tannin content will depend on the grape variety and the vinification and extraction processes that we mentioned earlier. In our first red wine, we're easing into the tannins and tasting a Pinot Noir. Pinot in general is known for its thin skins that impart naturally low levels of tannins to a wine. Pinot also contains fairly low levels of pigments, so it's rare to find a very deeply colored example. This particular bottle is from the Dundee Hills within the Willamette Valley in Oregon. The production method here is pretty different from the white wine we tasted because we see efforts to extract some color and tannins through the use of warm fermentation, punching down by hand, as well as some French oak aging. The result is a pale ruby wine with a pretty silky texture. The tannins here just barely linger on your gums above your teeth, as well as on the mid to back of your tongue. There's a touch of woodiness on the finish, so it's likely that we're feeling the effects of both condensed and enological tannins here, but the overall feel is soft and pleasant, exactly what we expect from Pinot Noir. To contrast the Pinot, we move on to Cabernet Sauvignon, a grape that has a thicker skin, a much higher concentration of pigments, and more importantly for our purposes here, has medium to high levels of tannins naturally. More often than not, we're going to see those tannins reach that higher end of the scale with Cab. Regardless of where in the world Cab is produced, this variety will always give wines that are both darker and significantly more tannic than Pinot Noir. This gives the wines an overall firmer structure. This particular example is from Walla Walla Valley in Washington State. The wine isn't 100% Cab, but at 87%, Cabernet Sauvignon is definitely the dominant grape, and we get a pretty good sense of the structure that we expect from Cab. I chose this wine because it demonstrates a distinct greenness in the tannins. In previous slides, we mentioned that greenness in wine can refer to not just flavors, but to the sensation of underripe tannins. The tannins here are really drying and almost grainy. They leave you with a dustiness on your palate that borders on astringent. This drying sensation really takes over, so it makes the wine feel a little lean and out of balance. Our second Cab, however, showcases what ripe tannins feel like. Here we have 100% Cabernet Sauvignon from Rutherford, which is within the Napa Valley in California. The overall feel of this wine is very different than our Washington State Cab. In this wine, we have the elevated levels of tannins that we expect from Cab, but we have a wine that's much more dense and almost chewy. The tannins here coat your palate, but in a pleasant way, and they add a plush texture to the wine overall. In this Cab, the tannins are bold, but they fit in with the wine structure and create a sense of balance, whereas in the previous wine, the tannins really stood out. 2014 was a drought year in Napa and Sonoma, and one of the results was ample ripeness, which is exactly what we feel in this Rutherford Cab. From Cab, we move over to Nebbiolo, which is another variety that is naturally high in tannins. Unlike Cab though, Nebbiolo doesn't even really veer into the medium territory, so most examples will showcase pretty elevated levels of tannins. This particular example is a Barolo from the 2014 vintage. This is a pretty youthful wine that hasn't seen a ton of bottle age aside from the appellation's stringent aging requirements, and I chose this bottle specifically for that reason. The producer here was generous enough to share the specifics of production, which started with a 20-day maceration in oak and periodic breaking of the cap in order to increase phenolic extraction. After fermentation, the wine is matured for at least 30 months in Slavonian oak casks. The tradition here in Barolo is to use large, older casks, which are pretty close to neutral in that they don't impart much flavor or even additional tannins to the wine. Knowing how high Nebbiolo's tannins are anyway, there's really no reason for a winemaker or producer to want to impart additional tannins to this style. Nebbiolo can be deceiving because the color is actually closer to Pinot Noir than it is to Cabernet Sauvignon, but this wine packs a pretty tannic punch. You take one sip and the acidity really shines through, but the tannins sneak up on you, and when they hit hard. There's no reprieve for your palate with young Barolo because the tannins feel like they continuously build even in between sips. Here, the tannins are tight, super grippy, and coat your entire palate. Your mouth is completely stripped of any and all moisture. However, it's important to note that these tannins aren't green, astringent, or even unpleasant. They're certainly not chewy like the Rutherford Cab, but rather fine-grained and pretty aggressive. Tasting young Barolo is an experience that may not be the most enjoyable, but a necessary evil in our quest to better understand tannins and their role in wine. Nebbiolo-based wines, especially those produced in Barolo, are said to be extremely long-lived, meaning they can be aged for a while. Not every age-worthy wine, however, has to be structured like Nebbiolo. There's plenty of white wines, for example, that are incredible after significant aging. Some champagnes can last for what feels like forever, and there's Pinot Noir-based Burgundies that evolve beautifully for years. However, we can't deny the role that tannins play in the aging process. Keep in mind that there's still a lot of research that can be done in this field, and some of the processes a wine goes through while it ages are not entirely clear. Tannins, like alcohol and acidity, are natural preservatives. We talked previously about the antioxidant properties of polyphenols, which act as a buffer for oxidation. The wine's overall phenolic content, which includes tannins, can help give a wine longevity by reducing the rate in which the wine oxidizes. This is just one possible theory as to why certain wines are so long-lived. If we compare the structure of a young wine with an old wine from a tannin standpoint, we see that the tannins in a young wine have a different molecular composition than those in aged wines. So another quick chemistry recap. Young tannins are small molecules that tend to keep to themselves. With time, these tannins start to break down or denature, which allows them to bind to themselves and to other phenolic compounds, including those that give wines color. These molecular chains start to get longer, a process called polymerization, but eventually become so large that they actually precipitate out of solution, which is why we're left with sediment. The result of this and other processes is that the wine starts to change color, it can lighten and turn garnet or even tawny, the overall texture becomes smoother and more round, and the tannins themselves feel far less astringent. It's important to note though that in order for wine to benefit from age, it has to have been a pretty great quality wine even in its youth. No amount of time is going to help a wine with unbalanced, harsh, or bitter tannins. The last two wines we're going to taste are two Riojas, one from 2015 and one from 2005. This side-by-side comparison is useful in showing what age can do to the structure and overall feel of a wine. Ideally, you'd want to do this with 2 bottles of the same exact wine but from different vintages. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury today, but I think these 2 wines will still do the trick. The blends here are slightly different, like our cab comparison, but the blended wine still serves the purpose of showcasing Tempranillo's structure. We're actually going to try the younger version first. This bottle is 100% Tempranillo, which is a grape that has thick skins and can have marked levels of tannins that range from medium to high. We have a wine here that's been aged in oak for just 18 months and, as expected, has a pretty significant tannic grip. It's not nearly as aggressive as Nebbiolo and maybe even a little less tannic than our cabs, but the tannins here are present. They're drying and tight, initially attacking the gums above your front teeth and continuing to build along your cheeks. The wine feels young, both in its structure and its overall flavor profile. Our aged Rioja is made up of 80% Tempranillo, but still gives us a good idea of Tempranillo's structure and an even more important idea of what age can do to a wine. Here we have a wine that was fermented under a controlled temperature and then saw a 32-day maceration followed by 10 months in new French oak and then an additional year in bottle. The more important aspect to focus on, however, is the 10-year difference between these 2 vintages. When you take a sip of this aged Rioja, you'll notice that the tannins are still present and they still have quite a bit of grip. Tannins are never going to completely drop away with age, but their overall feel is going to change, and in some cases change pretty dramatically. The fact that this wine still has present tannins and still showcases a flavor profile that hasn't fully developed into just tertiary aromas means there's still potential for additional aging here. Even though this wine still has a decent tannic grip, the tannins definitely feel softer and far less aggressive than the younger version. The wine has an overall leathery feel to it. In a blind tasting, it would be pretty clear that there's some age happening here. This wine doesn't have that youthful tightness we saw in the 2015 example. For someone with a little patience, the best thing to do would be to put aside this 2005 Rioja for maybe 5 years or more to really see the difference in the structure and feel, and to even see if the wine starts to throw off a little bit of sediment, which can come with age. The last thing I want to touch on is how to approach pairing food with tannic wines. I'm generally not a big fan of strict rules when it comes to food and wine pairings and feel that it's a topic that's far too subjective, but there are some points to keep in mind that may help produce a better union between certain foods and tannic wines. We know that tannins impart a drying sensation on our palates. The best way to counter this is with rich or fatty foods. Fat coats your palate and a tannic wine is going to help clear that away. But we also have to remember that foods of a certain weight need an equally weighty wine in order to keep one from dominating the other. When it comes to very tannic or bitter wines, it's best to avoid bitter foods because you're going to be left with a big, unpleasant, bitter mouthful. That being said, it's sometimes fun to try out pairings that shouldn't work just to see for yourself rather than relying on someone else's rules or preferences. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me today. I know this can be kind of a dry topic, but hopefully you have a better understanding of tannins and their role in wine.